What is the strangest scary post on Reddit you've seen in recent years? One day I saw a thread where you could easily find streams of someone's unprotected webcams. It was a whole bunch of people who didn't know they were being filmed by their own webcam. They just sat, walked and did other things, not realizing that someone was watching them now. It was very wild and strange. I still hate it. I remember a time when such threads became very popular. It seemed to me that I was going crazy, because most people watching such streams justified the whole action by saying that, well, they themselves did not password protect their webcam, which means they themselves ask other people to watch them. Like what? That's why I always tape up the camera. I saw too many movies about it when I was a kid. For some reason, even at a young age like 7 or 8, I always felt like I was being watched in the shower, in my sleep, while eating, in the toilet, and so on. It always seemed to me that somewhere above there is a camera that captures everything I do. The people who are watching me never interfere in my life, do not talk or discuss anything. They're just watching. A pretty weird feeling for a kid. The story of one woman who, I hope, was a fiction. She wrote that she was pregnant. Her husband and her husband's father were convinced that she would die in childbirth, as well as her husband's mother, and insisted that she pack all the things she wanted to give to her unborn child. And they also forced her to record a whole bunch of videos for the unborn child, since he would most likely never won't see his mother. The whole story was always going from one extreme to the other. From husband and father-in-law were terribly paranoid to husband and father-in-law were plotting her murder. A video of a husband and wife arguing with a man who lives across the street. The husband starts calling the man names and calling him a coward. The man pulls out a revolver and shoots the husband and wife several times as they try to escape. Then he goes after them and shoots them again. Then he goes to his house, takes a rifle and finishes them off. Then he takes his own life. It was all recorded on a garage camera. Just unbelievable, terrible. In fact, this story is a little more complicated. One of my colleagues was a neighbor of this killer in the past. That couple was buying up local real estate, and they were always very nasty to that man because they wanted his house, and he didn't want to sell his land in any way. This is by no means an excuse for his actions. So, this man was a lonely alcoholic veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder. His wife died of cancer. His neighbors were incredibly rude people who bullied him and other neighbors for years. In autumn, they raked leaves on his plot, left garbage in his yard. In winter, they constantly dumped all the snow on his driveway when he first put it away. They also had a son with autism who constantly messed with that man. He tried many times to get a restraining order to get them off his back once and for all. They received dozens of calls to the police. They damaged other people's property and threatened all the neighbors around. The situation was really difficult. They were also quite close friends with the chief of police, so complaints against them were usually dismissed. Finally, one day they decided to test the strength of that man and brought him to a white stupor. I repeat, I am not defending a murderer. I'm just saying that cornering a lonely alcoholic with mental health problems, threatening him with violence and forcing him to act, well, he can very easily dispel your bluff. In my opinion, this is the stupidest and most pointless fight I've ever seen. He literally pulls out a gun, and then that woman screams, "Do it," or "Shoot me," something like that. 6 times in a row, I swear to God, telling someone who pointed a gun at you to shoot is damn stupid. Don't do this. As far as I remember, this was a response to a discredited thread about double standards. One guy was sitting at the mall and looking after his little daughter, who was lying in a carrier while his wife was at the store. Then a well-dressed woman approaches him, takes a carrier with his daughter, and tries to escape. He immediately runs after her, trying to get his child back, and she screams that he is trying to kidnap her daughter. All the people around started attacking him and hitting him. That woman would have quietly left with the child if it hadn't been for this guy's wife, who came out of the store and snatched her daughter from that woman's arms. The unknown woman disappeared and was never seen again. I read a story about a guy who got cut up with a chainsaw. When he was working at a logging company in the wilderness, his friends called 911 and said they were going to take him to the hospital, as the ambulance would reach them only in an hour, and they wanted to go out to meet the ambulance. They were flying on a narrow road at full speed, but then they saw a car coming in front of them. They could not drive around it by the side of the road, as there were steep ravines and slopes on all sides. The woman who was riding in front stopped and blocked their path. Since Since she didn't like that they were driving too fast, she got out of the car and started telling them off for speeding. One of the guys got out of the car and just threw a bloody rag at her bumper when she didn't want to believe their story. Because of this, they had to wait for an ambulance for another 15 minutes. The guy died on the way to the hospital. If the ambulance had taken him 10 to 5 minutes earlier, he would still be alive. Since then, every time I see someone rushing at insane speed and driving recklessly, I stop playing the role of civilian police on the roads and just let the person pass. Maybe it's an emergency, or maybe the person is just a sheep, but I'm not going to be the cause of someone's death because I'm assuming the latter. One day I came across a video that I never want to see again, but it was firmly etched into my memory. One Egyptian man was driving a very expensive sports car, and then he tried to take a selfie of himself while driving the car extremely carelessly. I don't remember if he was drunk or not. He lost control and hit something hard. The camera captured footage of him being crushed between the dashboard and the seat. Almost immediately, he began to bleed, and somehow the camera captured his last few moments as the light in his eyes went out and he died. I saw this man for the first time and only once, but his face is forever etched in my memory. The threat of one guy who complained that his inadequate landlord was somehow sneaking into his house unnoticed and leaving threatening notes. It turned out that his carbon monoxide detector was out of order and he was hallucinating the whole time. I was reading a story about a young woman who was alone in a house that was in the middle of nowhere. At one point, she heard someone walking outside and trying to get in through different windows, like this one. Someone knew she was there alone. It was already scary enough, but what happened next is even worse. She didn't call the police. Instead, she called her boyfriend, who recommended that she turn on all the lights in the house and light herself up like a Christmas tree so that the person outside could see her, but she couldn't. When the intrusion attempts continued, her boyfriend very strongly advised her to leave the house. Even though she would have been outside with an uninvited guest, her eyes were not used to the darkness at all, and she followed the advice. She went outside, walked to the car, not knowing if it was working, and drove away. This story began rather frighteningly with the fact that someone was trying to break into the house. But what is even worse is the layer after layer of terrible decisions and advice that the woman received from her boyfriend and decided to follow them. Reminded me of a similar story. The girl was all alone in a house outside the city. There was only one forest around. The nearest neighbors were a mile or so away. It was winter and it was snowing. She stayed up late watching TV in the living room and eventually fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, in the snow, she saw a trail of footprints coming from the woods to her back door, then wet footprints that led directly to her couch, and then back into the woods. A post by a guy who wrote about 10 years ago that he was seriously psychologically traumatized and needed to talk to someone. He witnessed a woman being run over by a car. Just reading his story seriously impressed me for the rest of my life, and I couldn't stop remembering him for many years. A short version of the story. This guy came out of the store and saw a woman on a bicycle who was hit by an 18-wheel truck. She was dragged under the wheels. He heard and saw her screaming, and her head was bursting like a pimple. All this time, he simply did not understand what he was looking at, so he stood motionless for a second and then fell into a severe shock. His version of the story was much more detailed. I can't even imagine that I can recover from seeing something like this. I remember one video from the DVR of a car in which one family is driving along a country road. As they pass one truck traveling in the other direction, a small rock flies out from under the wheels of the truck and breaks through the windshield of the car, instantly killing the woman who was sitting in the passenger seat. In the video, you can't see what's going on inside the car, but in the audio, you can hear the screaming children and the crying father when they all realize that she's dead. It's incredibly heartbreaking. The story of a guy who decided to visit the Paris catacombs alone. His camera was later found, but his body was never found. I shudder every time I remember this story. I hope that his family has received a huge compensation from some company that owns these dungeons. Just yesterday I read Thread 2020 about people who talked about how they lived a double life for many years, had two families at the same time, hiding it from both families before the pandemic, and were caught doing it when they had to leave one of the families. Some people talked about their lives, some about the lives of their acquaintances, and throughout all this I was literally sick of how anyone could trust anyone at all after that. Their significant other does not know anything, thinks that their loved one is just at work, or goes on a business trip for a long time. But all this time, he was just living with another family. When I was pregnant, I was reading the stories of other pregnant women and came across one story in which one pregnant woman had fetal death. Unfortunately, she didn't pay attention to the various signs and symptoms and waited too long after reading it. I became extremely anxious because I had more than 75% of the described signs of it. I called my obstetrician the next day. I was admitted to the maternity ward. I gave birth a few weeks earlier. It turned out that I had the same problem as her: preeclampsia and the umbilical cord wrapped around my baby's neck. My child is alive only because of her post. I will never forget this woman. She deleted her story, and to be honest, I can't bring myself to try to find her. Guys, thank you very much for watching. There are more similar videos on the channel, and now they are on your screen. You can also join my Discord server where people write their stories and they can get into the video.